Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin by hearing some evidence from a representative of the M&E subcontractor, Max Fordham, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, Mr. Andrew McQuatt, please.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. McQuatt. Would you like to sit down and make yourself comfortable? Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for attending today to give your evidence. We really appreciate that. If you have any difficulty understanding anything that I'm asking you, please ask me to repeat the question or put it in a different way. And if you need a break at any point, please just let us know. And also try and keep your voice up so that the transcriber who's sitting to your right can take a note of what you're saying. Now, you've made one statement to the inquiry dated the 21st of September 2018. Can we turn that up? It's at MAX 30017292. And if we can look at page 27 of that statement, is that your signature there?
Yes.
And we can see the date. Actually, I think it's the 27th of September 2018. Is that correct? I think I'd said the 21st.
Oh, 27th.
Yeah, thank you. Have you read that recently?
Yes, I have.
And are its contents true?
Yes.
Great. And have you discussed your evidence with anyone before coming here today?
No.
Great. Now, just a few questions in terms of your background. If we look at paragraph 6 of your statement on page 2, there we can see you helpfully explain that you graduated from the University of Edinburgh with an MEng mechanical engineering degree, and then you began work at Max Fordham in Edinburgh as a graduate engineer in June 2007, and then you became a partner in the LLP in Max Fordham on the 5th of May 2011, and you remain working at Max Fordham to this date. And is it right, you're still working at Max Fordham?
That's correct, yeah.
Great. And then in the next paragraph, at paragraph 7, you say that during your time working at Max Fordham, prior to working on the Grenfell Tower project, you'd worked on a range of project sectors, and we can see that included housing, individual private dwellings, further education colleges, offices, cultural schools there. Had you worked on a high-rise residential project before the Grenfell Tower project?
No.
What about high-rise residential projects involving the overcladding of the building?
No.
No. Now, we know that on the Grenfell project, Max Fordham was appointed as building services engineers on the project. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, and acousticians. But the acousticians were run from our own...
And acousticians,
yeah.
Thank you. And is it right that such building services engineers are sometimes referred to as M&E engineers, standing for mechanical and electrical?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And you were the project engineer on the Grenfell project, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And is it correct that in your role as project engineer, you were responsible for the day-to-day running of the project for Max Fordham?
Yes.
And we know from your statement that you were involved in the project between the 31st of May 2012 and the 23rd of May 2013, when your involvement with the project ended and you became involved in other projects for Max Fordham. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, we're going to focus today, because this is what we're looking at in Module 1, on the exterior of the building, and in particular with you on the insulation material that was being used on the spandrels and the columns. And I first want to ask you some just general questions about the use of insulation in the construction industry. Is it right that the purpose of adding insulation to a building is to improve its thermal efficiency?
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
And when people speak of improving thermal efficiency, that means reducing the rate at which heat travels from a hotter element to a colder one. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does that mean improving the retention of heat in winter and avoiding overheating in the summer?
Yes.
And is it right that the rate at which a product for use in construction conducts heat can be measured in watts per metre squared Kelvin?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. And is this known as a lambda value?
Yes.
Yeah. And is it right that the lower the lambda value, the better, because this means fewer units of energy are being lost per metre squared?
That's right, yeah. The lower the lambda value, the thinner the material would need to be.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
Now, in relation to the building as a whole, is it right that when assessing its thermal performance, you need to consider how well or badly each of the building elements performs?
Yes. Yeah.
And is it right that a building element is a part of the building? So, for example, the walls, the windows, the roof. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And is it right that the thermal resistance of each building element is shown by its U value?
Yes. Yeah.
And this is also measured in watts per metre square Kelvin as well. Is that correct?
That's right. So yeah, I think that's watts per metre squared Kelvin would be the U value. The lambda value doesn't have the meters squared. It's to do with the linear
I see.
thickness.
Yeah. Okay. And again here, is it right that the lower the U value, the better
Yes.
in terms of thermal
In
efficiency?
terms of thermal efficiency, yes.
And is it correct that generally, I think you've already confirmed this, that you will need less of a material with a lower lambda value to achieve the desired U value than you would of a material with a higher lambda value?
That's correct, yes.
Now, in terms of the building regulations, do you agree that the U value of a building element is important because there are rules on how high it can be under the building regulations?
I do, yes.
And were you aware at the time that the statutory guidance about this is contained in approved document L,
Yes.
which is one of the practical guidance documents issued pursuant to the building regulations?
Yes.
And is it right that on the Grenfell project you were looking at approved document L1B?
Yes.
You look so you want to
Yeah,
add something.
No, I don't. I always get confused between the two. There's parts A and B, and there's parts 1 and 2, and often I always have to look it up to tell
Yeah,
which one's
fair enough. Understood. We'll go to it in a moment. And did you take approved document L into consideration when you were setting the U value for Grenfell Tower?
I personally, yes, I took it into consideration as far as I checked that the U values that were proposed were in line with
Yeah.
Part L, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now let's go to approved document L1B. This is INQ 3011283. Now, can you confirm that this was the version of ADL in force at the time you were working on the Grenfell project? We can see it's the 2010 edition, and it incorporates further 2010 and 2011 amendments. We get that in the bottom right-hand side. Can you see that?
Yes. Yes, I think it is the document that we were using.
Thank you. And if we turn on to page 19, we can see in the right-hand column that there's a heading Renovation of Thermal Elements. And it makes clear there that for the purposes of this approved document, renovation of a thermal element through the provision of a new layer means either of the following activities: cladding or rendering the external surface of the thermal element, or dry lining the internal surface of a thermal element. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And was that consistent with your understanding that that's what renovation of a thermal element meant?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, the next paragraph, at paragraph 5.8, explains that where the renovation covers a certain amount of the surface, the performance of the whole thermal element should achieve or better the U value in Table 3. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we're going to look at Table 3 in a moment and see what it said in terms of U values and the guidance it gave. But before we go to Table 3, if we just look while we're in this part of the document, over on page 20, at paragraph 5.9, and if we can just read this. I'm going to read this out to you. So 5.9 appears in the left-hand column towards the bottom of that page. I wonder if we could just blow it up a little bit more. There we go. Can you see that there? 5.9.
Yes.
And it says, if achievement of the relevant U values set out in column B of table 3 is not technically or functionally feasible, or would not achieve a simple playback of 15 years or less, the element should be upgraded to the best standard that is technically and functionally feasible, and which can be achieved with a simple payback of no greater than 15 years. And then there's some guidance on that approach in Appendix A. Now, I just want to check, did you understand that at the time of the Grenfell project, that if you couldn't achieve the U values that were set out in the guidance here, you had to achieve whatever was the best standard that was technically and functionally feasible?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Now then, at the bottom of this page, we get table 3. And is it right that on the Grenfell project, we needed to be looking at it's the second item down under element, wall, external or internal insulation? Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so this is what was relevant to Grenfell. And we can see in the right-hand column, column B, that the improved U value, the watts per metre squared Kelvin, had to be, or the guidance was saying 0.30. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, just before we leave approved document L, I just want to look back at page 4, towards the beginning of this document. And on the right-hand side, we see a heading, Consideration of Technical Risk. Yes, thank you. And here we get a paragraph, and I'll just read the key parts to you. It says, building work to existing dwellings must satisfy all the technical requirements set out, and then it explains which regulations of the building regulations. And then it says this, when considering the incorporation of energy efficiency measures in dwellings, attention should also be paid in particular to the need to comply with, and we've got Part B, fire safety, Part C, site preparation, and then other approved documents are also mentioned in that list. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And again, at the time of the Grenfell project, were you aware that approved document L made this link back to, for example, Part B, fire safety, making clear that attention also needed to be paid to those parts of the approved documents?
I don't recall reading that part.
Yeah.
I think I would have held that assumption,
Yes.
but without
Yes.
being aware of that paragraph.
Yeah. And just to be clear, we see this paragraph in other parts of approved document L, whether it's dwellings or non-dwellings. It has a similar statement about attention being paid to other parts of the approved documents. But I think what you just said is, although you weren't aware of this specific paragraph, you did have a general awareness that you needed to be aware of other parts of approved documents. Is that right?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
I mean, I guess if I put that in the context for a building services engineer, we would need to, we design pipes and ductwork that travels through and around buildings.
Yes.
And we often have to take a piece of ductwork through a compartment wall, for
Yes.
example. So we would refer to Part B, because Part B would give us the rules that we needed to know
Yes.
for those elements. So yes, I was aware of Part B in that
Yes.
context.
And exactly, and picking up on that, you also might, with those pipe work and duct work locations, have to think about insulation in those areas, mightn't you, as well?
The installation of
Pipe
the
work
pipe
and
work,
duct work
yes.
in compartments. You might have to think about insulation around the pipe work. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But
And that-
not necessarily in relation to Part B. I think if I was thinking of insulation around pipework, I would be thinking more about Part L and energy conservation
I see.
and things like that.
Okay.
Well, presumably you'd be thinking about Part B in relation to things like fire stopping if you were putting ducts through existing walls, wouldn't you?
That's right, yes.
Now, I now want to turn to some questions about your understanding of the requirements relating to fire safety at the time you worked on the Grenfell project. Now, were you familiar in general with Schedule 1 to the building regulations and the fact that there were functional requirements set out therein?
Yes.
And were you aware that there was Part B, fire safety, within Schedule 1 of the building regulations?
Yes.
Were you familiar with Approved Document B? Had you ever had to look at that in your work as a mechanical and electrical engineer?
Yes. I think it's the approved documents that you would go to on a day-to-day basis to, when you're dealing with the building regulations issues, you would go to the approved document Part B as your kind of first stop.
Yeah. And in practice, how would you access those approved documents? Did you have them in hard copy in the office, or did you look at them electronically?
Tend to look at them electronically.
Yeah.
And you would probably look at the index, do a word search for the types of things that you were thinking about at that particular time.
Yeah. So that was a common occurrence as part of your day-to-day job?
Yes.
Thank you. And did you have an awareness of the B4 requirements in relation to external flame spread? Was that something that was on your radar?
No.
No. And what was your understanding of the purpose of something like Approved Document B? What did you understand the purpose of it to be?
I understood that if you followed the guidance in the approved documents, then you are showing compliance with the functional requirements of the building regulations. So if you were operating within the bounds of the approved documents, you were in a safe place.
Yeah.
In terms of compliance.
Yeah. Now, at any stage when you were working on the Grenfell project, did you come to read Approved Document B on fire safety, or any part of it?
I think I would have accessed Approved Document B probably when we were discussing elements like the dry riser and about moving the inlet valve to the dry riser. And I know I would have checked Approved Document B, because that would be my go-to place to check on the rules for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I certainly didn't read it cover to cover.
No.
And I certainly didn't ever look up Part B4.
No. More specifically then, when you were considering what materials to be used as insulation in the tower, and making suggestions about those materials, and we're going to come on to look at what you did in that regard in a moment, when you were doing that, did you ever come to consider Approved Document B on fire safety?
No, I didn't.
Who did you think within the design team would be considering the requirements of Approved Document B relevant to the insulation of the external wall?
I would have thought the architect who was designing that element would have been looking at that, and it wouldn't have surprised me if they had sought further guidance from other parties, like the fire engineer, but that would have been my interface probably on that would have been with the architect.
Yeah, thank you. Now, if we can just briefly look at Approved Document B, this is CLG 50224, and if we start at page 93, this is the beginning of the B4 section, which you've already explained you didn't look at during the project. But I just want to ask you a couple of quick questions about this. On page 95, in the right-hand column, towards the bottom of that page, we get a statement there in the first paragraph where it says the external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it's likely to be a risk to health and safety. The use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. Now, you see that there. Now, I appreciate you didn't come to specifically look at this on the project, but were you generally aware at the time of the project that the use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities might present such a risk in tall buildings?
No, I wasn't.
were you aware that there was specific guidance given in approved document B about insulation materials and their combustibility?
No, I wasn't.
So if we just look at one more thing in approved document B, on page 96, we get paragraph 12.7. If we can blow that up, there we see it. Insulation materials products. So it says in a building with a story 18 metres or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, not including gaskets, sealants and similar, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And is it right that you weren't aware at the time that insulation products on buildings above 18 metres should be something called limited combustibility?
That's correct. Yeah.
Had you ever heard the term limited combustibility being used about the fire performance of materials such as insulation?
No.
Had you ever heard of the term class naught or national class naught about building materials, including insulation materials?
I can't recall with any certainty. There's been so, from between then and now, there's been so much talk of things like this, and it's really difficult
I understand.
to pin that down whether I knew about that or not.
How do you-
Sorry. We
carry
do
on.
specify things like cables, and cables will also have classifications like those. So
Yeah.
maybe in terms of that sort of thing, then perhaps
Yeah.
I was aware in that context.
Okay. In your time at Max Fordham, had you ever attended any courses or other training on the building regulations and the associated guidance, including in approved document B on fire safety?
I wouldn't say we had we never had one particular lecture that could, with that heading that springs to mind. I guess one of the ways that we worked, as I kind of said before, the approved documents they are a go-to document in terms of the way that we're trained. We would be shown by our supervisors to look at these documents and to reference them, and then things like, often when we have CPDs, so people would come into our practice and they would maybe give us a talk on a certain subject, and that subject would never be, I'm coming in to do a talk on the building regulations, but it'd be very common for a manufacturer to come in and for them to have some slides on the building regulations as part of the talk. So I would say there's, throughout my career, the topic of building regulations and how products might, if a manufacturer comes in to talk about something, then they might reference the building regulations.
Yeah. Now, you were talking about CPD there, and you mentioned, I think, a couple of times that manufacturers would come in and talk to you. Is it right that a lot of the CPD that was done through Max Fordham was as a result of manufacturers coming in, talking to you about specific products, which then might touch on compliance issues?
Yes, I think what we sort of define as CPD is when someone comes in and has a talk to us.
Yeah.
But then there might be a sort of broader sense of CPD where we have our own internal lunchtime talks and graduate lectures and things like that, which again, but they would also touch on building regulations matters if they were relevant.
Yeah. But I think you've confirmed that it was common, am I right, for manufacturers to come in and give
Yes.
CPD type talks?
Yeah, it's one of the ways that they use to get you thinking about their products and their name, and so they use that as a common...
Yeah. At the time of the Grenfell project, were you aware of any other industry guidance documents which were relevant to external wall construction or the materials to be used, for example, for an insulation product?
No.
So if I said that there might have been guidance by something called the Centre for Windows and Cladding Technology, the CWCT, would you have ever come to look at that?
No.
Now, just before we get into what happened on the project and your involvement in the insulation issue, I want to just explore briefly Max Fordham's contractual responsibilities on the project and the scope of works that they were doing. Now, we know that the initial proposal from Max Fordham was a fee proposal put forward by your colleague Bill Watts. Were you aware of that at the time you were working on the project?
I can't honestly remember.
Don't worry. So let's just look at that fee proposal. This is MAX 6075. And this is the initial fee proposal. I think there was a subsequent one that was very similar. And this one was dated the 21st of June 2012. Did you ever see any documents like this or any other contractual terms relevant to Max Fordham's appointment to the Grenfell project?
It's very, again, it's very difficult to say with absolute certainty that I saw this, but all I can say is it's quite normal working on a project to have a look at the fee offer, to check it, to make sure you're doing the right things.
Yeah. So you may well have seen this.
I may well have done. Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, I may well have seen this.
Yeah. Okay. Just looking at this, we can see in the first part under the heading scope, 3 paragraphs down, there's a sentence that begins, "We understand that the priorities of the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower are as follows," and then there's a list of priorities, and a third one there is improving the thermal efficiency and visual appearance of the facade, possibly complementary to calc. Now, just breaking that down, did you understand that one of Max Fordham's roles was to help improve the thermal efficiency and visual appearance of the facade? Sorry, thermal efficiency of the facade.
Yes.
Yeah. And were you aware that it was one of the key priorities of the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower?
Yes. I recall my very first visit to the tower, getting off at the train station, looking up at the tower with Bill, and Bill talking me through what the job was and what we were going to do, and he very clearly were looking at it, overcladding. That was going to happen. That was part of it. So it was very much embedded in my mind that was going to be part of this job.
Thank you. Yeah. And was it also your understanding that visual appearance was a priority for the refurbishment?
I can't see why it wouldn't have been. You know, you're making such a huge intervention to this tower. You're obviously going to change its appearance by insulating it. You're going to change its appearance in a really major way. Yeah. And so, yeah. Yeah. But bring it up, and I think we've said here, with the CALC project, you've got the new academy and leisure centres next door, so I think they wanted to help tie it all together. Yeah,
thank you. Now, if we look at the bottom of this page, for a moment, if we can just zoom in the bottom. Yes, so what's proposed here is that the offer for mechanical and electrical services is based upon Max Fordham providing a design in accordance with, and then there's reference to the ACE Schedule of Services Part GB, Mechanical and Electrical Engineering, Detailed Design and Building. So this is a standard form document that was produced by the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, ACE. Again, were you aware that the terms of Max Fordham's appointment were pursuant to that type of agreement?
I believe I would have. I am aware of the ACE agreements, and that's a common thing for us to use. In terms of referencing it, I wouldn't have gone to it. And as at my role then, I wouldn't have gone to that on a regular basis. I would have allowed my supervisor to kind of understand the finer details of the AC agreement and make sure I was on the right track. I understand. Yeah. And we see there that what in the next line at the end of that first paragraph under M&E services, it says we have included for all services described in Part G2 and the following other services in Part G3. And then we get 2 services that are particularly relevant to the work that Max Fordham did in relation to the thermal efficiency of the tower. It's G311, develop energy efficient strategies for the fabric and engineering services, and then G317, work in connection with assisting the architect in obtaining building regulation compliance, Part L. You see those 2 things there? Yes. At the time of the project, did you understand that those were 2 of the key services that Max Fordham was providing on the job? I believe I would have done. I think these additional services are something that we quite commonly would put into one of these, because it's a place where we can add value to our offers. So that's quite a common thing, so I believe I would have been aware of.
Yes, understood. And I think, and those do appear in the final version of the signed ACE agreement with the TMO, between the TMO and Max Fordham. We've got that document. And did you understand that Max Fordham was responsible on the project for the provision of consultancy services and advice in relation to energy strategy and sustainability pursuant to the contract with the TMO?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Now, the contract that was subsequently signed, in fact, incorporated the ACE Schedule of Services Part GC, not Part GB. Did you have any involvement in that?
No, I didn't.
No, fine. Now, in terms of others that were appointed on the project, when did you become aware that Studio E had been appointed as architect on the project?
For me, as soon as I started on the project, they were already the architects, and I was introduced. So Bill had already laid the groundwork for setting the project up, and so by the time I came onto the project, I was very much being introduced to, this is the team, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Run with the start on the design work, essentially.
Yeah. Were you also aware that Exover had been engaged by the TMO to provide some fire safety engineering services?
Yes, I think I was. Yeah, because I did ask them some questions on the smoke vent system when I worked on the project. So I knew that they were involved.
Now, if we can look now at an email, this is SEA 403568, and I want the second email down on that page, sent at 21:20. Now, this is not an email that you were involved in. It's a chain between Mr. Cushell of Studio E and Mr. Soons at Studio E. But I just want to ask you something about it. So I want to look in particular at the last paragraph. He says there, I feel first I need to acknowledge receipt, ask to meet, then walk the site with him to understand the scope described, probably with Neil. And then he says this, we are a little green on process and technicality, so I propose some rapid CDP, I think that should read CPD, MF being my first port of call. And then he said, I'll hold off circulating this until we understand their thinking on consultants. Can you see that there?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Great. Now, this is a very early email that Mr. Soons sends to Mr. Cushell about the prospect of Studio E being involved in the Grenfell project. And when Mr. Soons gave evidence, he confirmed that MF there, MF being my first port of call, was Max Fordham. Yeah. Now, can you help us as to whether Studio E did ever, in fact, approach Max Fordham for some rapid CPD on the project?
So, yeah, as we've said, this is a long time before the start of my involvement in the project. All I could add to that would be, I know from looking at our email records that there was other people at Max Fordham who seemed to have conversations. I think one person did go to site with Bruce, possibly before I was involved. I only recently became aware of this.
Yeah.
When I started on the project, I'd assumed I was the first Max Fordham engineer to be shown around the building, but only recently I discovered that that's not necessarily the case. Maybe some other people had done earlier on, sort of perhaps in February time.
Yeah.
But I couldn't add anything else to what they might have said or.
Yeah. Okay. In his evidence, Mr. Soons, when asked about this, said he thought that it involved a consultation which took place by phone. Can we just be clear that that wasn't a consultation with you?
It wasn't with me.
No. Was it your understanding when you were working on the project and when you were involved that Studio E were looking to Max Fordham to provide guidance generally in respect of process and technicality?
I think what I could answer that by saying I think what Studio E were looking to us to do were to help them work out whether it was even possible to replace a heating system and a hot water system in a tower while it was occupied without interrupting the supply of water or heat to any of, to those flats. It was a complex problem, and I would clearly that's the why we are there as sub-consultants, to help Studio E with areas that they are unable to deal with, and obviously that's why they wanted us in, to help them work out whether the heating system could be replaced and these challenges could be met.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of what Studio E were leaning on us, it would have been quite rightly in the areas that we were employed to give advice on, like the heating and hot water system.
And in relation specifically to the insulation of the tower and improving the thermal efficiency with the overcladding, did you ever get the impression that Studio E were relying heavily on Max Fordham, helping them understand how to go about that kind of project?
I don't think so. I think obviously we'll come on to the emails,
and
the emails focus heavily on insulation, but if you don't take the insulation into account just yet, there wasn't emails asking us how we should do other elements of the cladding system.
Right.
So I didn't feel like we were being asked really at those early stages to comment on the technicalities of the facade.
In your dealings with Studio E on the project, did those dealings ever suggest to you that they might be inexperienced with regards to technical issues connected with the refurbishment?
I knew that the project engineer that I was working with, Adrian, I knew he hadn't done a high rise when we were working, because when we were walking around the tower, he told me as such. But it was my experience that people often do. Everyone does something for the first time, and so that didn't really ring alarm bells for me. That was just the architect I was working with, who sat below Bruce. So I wasn't viewing it as I wasn't assessing Studio E as a practice. It was just between the two of us as two people working on a job, and I knew. I knew I felt supported, but I couldn't comment on how they felt.
Thank you. And you mentioned Adrian there. Was that Adrian Jess at Studio E?
Adrian Jess.
Yes, thank you. Let's just look at Mr. Soon's witness statement for a moment. This is SEA 30144273 at page 32. And I want to look at paragraph 64. And he says this: in the internal email, I expressed my view that I felt Studio E was a little green on process and technicality, because Studio E as a practice had not previously been involved in high-rise residential, heating renewal, nor the overcladding of occupied buildings. I said I would speak to Max Fordham to develop my understanding of the process. And then he says, I learned that they had indeed been involved in similar projects before, and despite my initial uncertainty, I was comfortable that Studio E had the experience and expertise to take on the work being discussed at this stage. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, who was it, do you think, at Max Fordham that Mr. Soons might have spoken to about similar projects before? Would that have been your immediate line manager?
It certainly wasn't me. It would have had to have been Bill Watts, or Mark Palmer, who was actually my line manager. But I would believe it probably Bill Watts, because he was setting the project up. Yeah.
Now, at this point, I just want to look at an email relating to Exova. This is SEA 405686. And again, this is not an email you were involved in, but what we see here is in August 2012, Mr. Soons gives Kate Cooney at Exova, he gives her some contact details, including your contact details. He says the contact at Max Fordham Services Engineers is. And my question for you is, did you ever have any communications with Exova in relation to the choice of insulation for the rain screen cladding system on the tower?
No, I didn't.
Great. Now, prior to putting forward the fee proposal, Max Fordham were present at several early design team meetings, and I just want to look at a few of the minutes of those meetings. if we can go to ART 6037. Now, these are design. This is a design team meeting on Thursday, the 24th of May, 2012, and this was attended by your colleague Bill Watts. He's there in the present list. You're not there either in the present list or in the distribution list for this one. On page 2 of that document, under services, I just want to look at what the minutes record. So it's in the middle of the page, and I want to look at the second paragraph down, and it says, design team need environmental design criteria, U values, ventilation openings, etc. to progress cladding design. Options discussed, overcladding, internal lining, fixed windows with acoustic louvres. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, with reference to internal lining, can you help us as to what that reference might be referring to?
So that would be talking about whether, well, I assume, because obviously I wasn't at this meeting, but I think we might have had a similar conversation at a meeting I was at. So when we're talking about internal lining, it would be, let's not put the insulation on the outside of the building, let's put it on the inside, on the flat side of the tower.
And were you ever involved in a discussion about that on the project?
Only very briefly. It was very quickly discounted as there was far too much disruption. These were people's homes, and the idea of going into people's homes and ripping out the entire wall finish was just unimaginable amount of disruption. So it was very quickly discounted.
Yeah. Thank you. Now, if we turn to another set of design team meetings, this time further forward in time on the 25th of June 2012. This is ART 6096, and I want to look at page 2. Sorry, before you go on to page 2, what we see here is that you're not in the present list, but you're in the distribution as present list. Do you see that? Three people up from the bottom. Can you see your name?
Yes.
Does that mean that you would have received the minutes of this design team meeting?
Yes.
And any other design team meetings that you were on the project for?
Yes, I believe you can see Bill Watts and Matt Smith were both present.
Yes.
And I think by that point I had started to attend meetings with Matt Smith, and this particular occasion was because I was on holiday. So Bill was basically stepping in for me with Matt in this meeting, and I would have received these.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. And then if we go to page 2 of this, and it's at the bottom of the page, immediately above the heading acoustics, we see this. It says MF indicate target U values for walls as 0.15 watts per metre squared Kelvin and 0.22 watts per metre squared Kelvin for windows, subsequently corrected to 1.6. I think that's the windows corrected to 1.6. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there was I think it was originally 0.16 for the windows in the original minutes, and we had to say that's impossible to achieve.
Yeah.
It was just the decimal
the
points.
typo. Yeah. And then in brackets we see it says limiting U values given in part L1B are 0.30 and 1.8 respectively. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, so we've looked at approved document L1B already this morning, and we've seen where the 0.30 comes from in table 3 of ADL. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. But in terms of the first part of that minute, and the initial part, Max Fordham indicate target U values for walls as 0.15. Can you explain to us the rationale behind indicating a target U value of 0.15 at that time?
I can. So what I'll say is I didn't. I'll explain first where that number came from, and then maybe a bit of rationale behind it. So, I mean, when I was looking back at this, I knew the 0.15 figure wasn't, say, something that initially came out of my mouth, because you can see the number being written down here for the first time in a meeting that I wasn't actually present at. But looking back at the emails that I received, I see that the very first email that I received from Bill Watts introducing me to the Grenfell Tower project, he'd attached a Word document, and in there, one of the one of the paragraphs was about U values, and it said, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was along the lines of, we should go for new build targets, and I didn't say any more than that. And then from that point on, possibly when I met Bill on site and we were looking at the tower, again, I think that we should be going for new build targets here was repeated, and I think it's, if you were to build a tower from scratch and you were to build a concrete tower, apply insulation to that concrete frame and apply rain screen, that didn't seem any different from doing the renovation. It seemed like the perfect place to start, and it was very similar to how you would construct a new build. So because it was so similar to how you might construct a new build, those new build targets didn't seem crazy. Why they seemed like they would be not that difficult to achieve, and so it was just something that was accepted as a good idea. And then I think as soon as we expressed that at these design team meetings, there was just a general acceptance that it was the good, right thing to be trying to do.
Right thing, why?
The right thing because we might come on to. I know in the planning statement that we helped to write, I kind of express my feelings in the introduction to that planning statement, and I say, my words were something like, you will only get a chance to do a renovation like this once in a building's lifetime. And we're trying to look to the future and trying to look to making this a building that would still stand up in 30 years' time. And so we wanted to do something now that would stand up in the future. And also you have things like the London Plan, which is a planning policy, and it very clearly states a hierarchy of things you should try to do when building a new building or renovating a building. And it very clearly states that the top tier of that hierarchy is to reduce energy use by improving the fabric of a building first. So that should always be the first step you take, rather than just slapping on fancy gizmos and gadgets onto a building. You should and I think there was from other projects that I'd worked on, I think there was a general feeling in the construction industry that people recognised the importance of improving the fabric of a building as the first step that you should do.
Is it fair to say that environmental considerations, energy efficiency, were at the heart of why that U value was selected?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And were you conscious at the time that was, because it was the target for a new build, were you conscious at the time that was a very ambitious target?
I didn't ever think of it as an overly ambitious target. I thought of it as a sensible target. Again, we were working on other projects, other new build projects in London, which might have had would be common to come across even lower U value targets in order to meet the CO2 targets of the London Plan. And the buildings that I could see that were being constructed, a lot of them were being constructed of concrete with insulation and rain screen, and so nothing seemed out of the ordinary in what we were trying to do here.
Now, we know you haven't done a high-rise residential before, an overcladding before. When Max Fordham were proposing that target, were any checks done with anybody within Max Fordham who had been involved in an overcladding project before?
Certainly not that I'm aware of, but I think that would have to be. I couldn't answer that. Bill put forward the 0.15 watts a metre squared, and that's something he would have to answer. I can't. I just, all I can say is I wasn't aware of a wider discussion about it. I was just kind of, okay, Bill was a very, very senior person in our practice, and he'd won this job, and I'm receiving a set of meeting minutes that tell me that this is a U value, and I was, although totally on board with it, I never came up with it in the first instance. So I struggle to really
see.
dig deep into the rationale of where it came from.
Would it be fair to say, as far as your thinking went, that you were very much comparing it and having in mind new build targets when you were selecting it?
Yes. Yeah.
Was it any part of your thinking at the time that because that figure of 0.15 was significantly below the guidance in approved document L, that there was room for adjustment if that became necessary? Was that any part of your thinking?
I think it was. I think we knew, and as well, I was, as you say, I was aware of the clause in Part L that basically says, here's the targets, but if you find any of these things too hard to do, then you can just relax your target. I was aware of that, and that would have been absolutely an acceptable thing to do.
Did you expect that when that was proposed that others on the project might push back and say, no, that's just too ambitious? Did you have that expectation when it was proposed by Max Fordham?
I don't think I had an expectation, but it seemed to just be widely accepted and widely sort of accepted by the other members of the design team. So,
And that wasn't surprising to you?
I think I found it quite positive that here was an aspirational target being proposed, and there was people who were willing to go with it because they believed in it, and I felt that was quite a positive experience. So if I was surprised, I was only surprised in a good way, because often targets are reduced because of money, because, well, let's reduce that target because we can't afford it. So the fact that the client and everyone was behind it and willing to pay for it, it was a positive experience for me that here we're going to build a building of really high quality and we're going to do a really good thing, and it sort of it backed up that feeling that I had.
I see. Was any consideration ever given during your time of working on the project to making an adjustment to the U value and increasing it?
The only time I think that it would have sort of come into our minds is when we were looking at the thickness and we were trying to work out whether the thickness could be accommodated within the build-up that the architect had deemed to be the maximum build-up that could be accommodated. And so I think as we looked through those issues, if there had been a point in time if we couldn't have achieved the 0.15 within the thickness that the architect had drawn, then I think we would have changed it. But we never got to the point where we didn't think there was a reasonable technical solution to meet what we were trying to achieve. So we didn't ever have that pushback.
Yeah. Does it follow from your answer, therefore, that there was never any serious discussion about raising the U value target?
No, there wasn't a serious discussion about it. No.
And just to be absolutely clear, these minutes suggest that it was Max Fordham suggesting this target U value of 0.15. Do you agree with that that came from Max Fordham and not from any other party, the client or the architect? It came from Max Fordham?
I agree with that, yes.
Yeah.
It came from Max Fordham.
Now, if we can turn then to an email, SEA 404737. And this is an email from your colleague Matt Smith. I beg your pardon, it's the third email down, sorry, at 1642, sorry. Yes, it's from Matt Smith to Bruce Soons, so it's your colleague to Bruce Soons, and this is just before that meeting on the 25th of June 2012 that we were just looking at. And he says, afternoon, Bruce, do you have an idea on the likely wall cladding build-up yet? What U value are you targeting? the early indications from the acoustic survey are that, and he goes on to say that they're around 300 millimetres deep, so it'd be useful to know what depth of wall we'll be working with. You see that there. Now, that suggests that Max Fordham were looking to Studio E, saying what U value are you targeting?
Yes.
But just to be clear, is it your understanding that it was Max Fordham who actually then came up with the target of 0.15?
Yes, I think what we did here, we were looking for details from the architect, and really the architect's designing the whole wall system, and so we were asking them, where have you got to with this? What U value do you think you can achieve? And obviously subsequently we suggest a U value, and I think it's not. We were trying to, I guess we were trying to push it on without suggesting something ourselves, because it's always better if someone's come up with the target themselves, in order so that we're not too heavily involved with it. You see a lot of things where the people say your insulation or your U value, and it's sometimes it can be quite difficult, because you're being put in a position where people are saying this is your target, but you don't actually have any power to specify any of the elements they're talking about. So for us, I was trying to, and I believe I had a conversation with Matt before he sent his email, and I think the intention of this email was to try and trigger that notion that these aren't our walls, these are your walls. Can you please show us the details, please?
Yeah.
And I suspect what happened after this was they said, but we just don't know we're just not sure what a good target would be. Can you help? And I think that's what we've said. Yeah.
Now, Mr. McQuatt, you just said, and I suspect what happened after this.
Yeah, I could.
Do you have any clear recollection of any U value target actually then being suggested by Studio E? We can't see it in any of the documents.
Sorry, no, I don't think Studio E suggested a document.
Okay.
Suggested a U value. I think.
Thank you.
We did.
And was it your understanding that you were proposing a U value, but that Studio E was ultimately responsible and therefore could overrule that and say, no, too ambitious, we're going to go for 0.3 or something like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. That is the general life of a building services engineer. You're there to give advice and to do the best, but the architect is the lead, and they will say, well, thank you very much for that advice, but it's not possible in this instance. That's a common thing to happen.
Yeah. And just to pick up in your witness statement, you make a similar point. If we go to paragraph 101 of your statement on page 24, in the first two lines, we see this is where you said it in your statement. Nothing was being fixed at this stage. The U values were no more than targets and were always capable of amendment or change depending on the circumstances or any input from others responsible for specifying the cladding requirements. Now, do you recall ever making clear to others on the project, including the architect, that as far as you were concerned, that target could be changed if it was problematic? Was there ever that discussion that went on?
I don't recall having that discussion explicitly. No.
Prior to proposing the target U value, just to be clear, to your knowledge, did you or anyone else within Max Fordham check whether there was anything in approved document B on fire safety which might affect whether that U value could be achieved?
I certainly didn't, and I'm not aware of anything.
And so there was no check of section 12 of ADB and what it might have said in there about insulation?
I think so.
Sorry, was that a no?
No, sorry.
Yeah, if you shake your head, that
Sorry.
doesn't appear on the transcript, so thank you. Whose responsibility did you think it was on the project to check the provisions in ADB on fire safety in respect of insulation products used in the external wall?
I don't think I would have thought of it in that explicit terms, but I think I would have thought the architect's designing the walls, therefore they'll take care of compliance.
Let's see. Now, if we can turn to SEA 404973. This is an email of the 5th of July 2012 from Mr. Soons to you and Matt Smith and Bill Watts, also at Max Fordham. And the subject's Grenfell Tower. And we want to just pick up on the final paragraph of this email that he's talking about being disappointed that a meeting didn't happen in the first paragraph. And then he says this in the final paragraph: we've sent off inquiries to Rockwall and Kingspan on the insulation and await their reply. The 0.15 U value you've asked for looks to me a bit aspirational. See attached, which suggests approximately 450 millimetre plus of insulation. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, we'll look in due course at the attachment that he sent, but just at this point, was there any consideration given or any discussions held to changing the U value, given what he says there about looks to me a bit aspirational?
When I read this email, there was certainly a hint of the fact that we might have to change the U value, because clearly the rock wool thicknesses were thicker than the architect felt could be accommodated in the build-up. But of course, the email says we've sent off inquiries to Rockwool and Kingspan.
Yeah.
So when I read that, I didn't worry too much, because I thought I knew that a Kingspan solid insulation board would have a better lambda value than the Rockwool, or lower lambda value than the Rockwool. So I knew that the Kingspan would come back with thinner thicknesses of insulation. And so I didn't feel the need to jump on this email, because I thought, well, we're waiting, and as the email says, and we await their reply. So at the time, I looked at that and I thought, well, okay, it might need to change, but we'll overridingly, we will wait their reply. So I think I just looked at that and thought, well, let's see what Kingspan have to say.
Yeah. So there was no separate discussion within the design team with you and Studio E at this point about changing the value?
No.
And you say there that you knew that Kingspan had a solid insulation board that would have a better lambda value. How did you know that? What was that? What was that based on, that knowledge of the Kingspan product?
I think probably one of the first jobs I ever did at Max Fordham was to sit and do a U value calculation in order to do a heating calculation. So it's kind of a thing you would commonly do designing a heating system. The first thing you would do is you would look at a wall build-up, and if the architect hasn't provided you with the U value, which you would need to know to measure the heat loss of the building, you would do a quick calculation yourself just to get yourself in the right ballpark. So I was at that point, I was used to seeing buildings coming in, being asked to do a heat loss calculation. I would see the insulation was a Kingspan. I would be aware of where to go to get what documentation to go to get the right lambda value to plug into my calculation. So I think there was a kind of awareness there of different insulation types and
was there a
values.
particular type of insulation produced by Kingspan that you had in mind at this point?
I think the only thing I knew about Kingspan was it was a solid board,
Yeah.
rather than a mineral wool or a softer kind of insulation. So I think that's really as far as my knowledge went.
Yeah. If we can look at another email on this topic, this is at SEA 405818. So this is an email of the 15th of August 2012, so a bit later in time, from Mr. Soons to you, copying in Matt Smith on the Grenfell project. And I want to look at the paragraph right at the bottom of this email, after the numbers and the list. And he says this: we need to discuss U value / insulation spec. I found a U value calculator here, and he gives the link, and made a stab at insulation thickness to achieve the 0.15 U value. Attached is from the website. I'm not sure how to make allowances for the brackets. Remember, we have an issue with the insulation around the columns, and I don't want you advertising something we A, aren't showing, and B, we can't achieve. Can we discuss? Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Just picking up on a few things in this, what was the issue with the insulation around the columns that he's referring to expressly there?
What Bruce had expressed to me, the issue was that the columns were very close to the windows, and the diamond-shaped column, you had the kitchen window right next to it. If we started adding thicker and thicker insulation to that column expands in size, and the edge of that column then starts to move in and encroach on the kitchen window. And so I understood that we didn't want that to happen. And so we may have already had a phone call about this, but I had an understanding that the desire was to keep the insulation on the columns thinner than the rest of the facade elements.
Yeah. And he says, can we discuss? Did you have a discussion with Mr. Soons around this time about the U value and whether or not that was achievable, whether it should be amended? Was there any such discussion?
I think these documents were leading up to the planning report, where we were going to tell planners what the U value target was. And so we needed to make sure it was buildable and it was right. And I believe Bruce's uncertainties were there wasn't a calculation that covered all the different elements. So the spandrel panels, the window infill panels, and the column. There wasn't an overall average calculation being done at that point. And I think what Bruce was worried about was when we actually looked at the columns and it would be a bit thinner, that would impact our ability to meet the overall 0.15, and therefore we shouldn't be advertising the 0.15. We should be saying what we can actually achieve. And I think he was looking for help from me to understand that could be achieved.
Yeah. And just to be clear, was there any serious discussion at this point about changing the U value?
I don't recall, but I think it was implied in the sections were becoming more firm. You know, the space allowed for insulation was starting to become more and more fixed on the drawings, and so I think from my point of view, by the time we got to this stage, it had become a little bit like you've got 200 millimeters for insulation in this wall. And now we're going to check to see what we get, and we hope that it achieves a 0.15. But I think if it didn't, I think it would have been back to the drawing board on the 0.15, rather than changing the sections at that point. Because I think we were balancing so many different aspects, and with the window depths, and I think the architect was quite happy with that build-up they'd drawn. So I think at this point it became less about a conversation of, well, the facade can just infinitely change to accommodate the U value. I think at this point it started to get a little bit like, well, we don't want to be changing these sections, so.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just look? There's another 2 emails on this same theme about whether any consideration was given to amending that U value target. Let's go to another email. This is SEA 408181, and I want to start by looking at kind of halfway down page 2. There's an email dated the 2nd of September 2013 from a Mr. Von Turch, Keith Von Turch at British Gas. And it's an email to the TMO. What subsequently happens, and we can trace this through in a moment, is it gets forwarded to Studio E, and then it gets forwarded to Duncan Campbell at Max Fordham eventually. And what we can see in this email is that Mr. Von Tersch is saying in the second paragraph, he says this, as discussed at the meeting, there are a number of areas that we need to confirm so that we can price up a funding offer accurately for you. We have the report from Max Fordham that gives some of the information, but a few gaps still remain. We need you to send through. And then he asks in the first bullet point for information on the insulating material for the walls. We mentioned that previous projects have not reached a U value of 0.15. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So he's saying that he's mentioned with someone in discussion with the TMO that previous projects have not reached the 0.15. Were you ever made aware of this email during the time you worked on the project?
No.
No.
It's long after my involvement ended.
And just if we go right to the very top of the page, page 1, we can see that eventually this does get forwarded to, I beg your pardon, Duncan Campbell is copied in here to this email chain, including the British Gas email, but you didn't see it?
No.
No. Can we look at another Studio E email? This is SEA 30144346. And if we start on page 1, there's an email here from Thomas Reck to Bruce Soon. So this is an internal email within Studio E, copying in others. And he then sets out, we can see at the very bottom of this page, some BREEAM potential scoring assessment comments. Can you help us as to what BREEAM is?
It's the Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method.
Yeah.
And it's it's a way of measuring the kind of sustainability credentials of a project. And often funders will have a minimum requirement that they would say, well, we would like you to get a certain score in order for us to give you money towards this project.
Yeah.
It's one of the ways it can be used.
Now, I appreciate this is an internal email within Studio E, which you wouldn't have seen at the time. But if we go on to page 2, and there's a heading, Environmental Impact of Materials. It's MAT 1. Yeah, so third item down, it says MAT 01, Environmental Impact of Materials. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And then there's some black text in the last paragraph there that says, it also seems MF went for OTTU values to achieve maximum credits available for thermal performance criteria, which come to force if Green Guide rating credits do not achieve the top 25 credits available. Now, we understand, and this was confirmed by the Studio witnesses, that OTTU values went over the top U values, yeah, when they refer to OTT. Mm-hmm. Now, did anyone ever suggest to you from Studio E, or indeed anyone else on the project, that the U values were over the top?
No. I think it's, as I said earlier, I think I felt really comfortable in a positive way that there was a good buy-in for this strategy. So no one referred to them in that way.
Now, if we can look next at an email from July 2012. This is SEA 405276.
Is it worth to point out that this comment couldn't be right, because as we've seen the 0.15 was discussed at a very, very early stage of the project, and it wasn't. The project was running for several months with everyone with that understanding until the BREEAM actually, we didn't realise at the start of the project that we needed a BREEAM score. So that came in slightly later. So all the decisions about 0.15s were done before this. So to suggest that the 0.15 was being done to get some credits in a scoring scheme that we didn't actually know we were going to have to comply with, it just couldn't have been right.
I understand. Thank you. That's helpful. So if we can go to SEA 405276. This is an email of the 24th of July 2012 from Bruce Soons to you and Matt Smith. And I just want to read the whole of this email with you. He says, Andrew, Matt, I asked Rockwall about achieving 0.15 U values, and this is their response below. We have been working on a maximum of 250mm build-up to the spandrel zones. The decision on the final system is pending, but assume a 50mm panel vent zone, leaving you 200mm for insulation. The geometry at the columns results in a reduced build-up of approximately 200mm, 150mm insulation at high level. At low level, we're thinking of cladding the columns in brick, and then he talks about that. And then he says, pushing the cladding line out any further will probably have buildability below and aesthetic issues. We are proposing extensive areas of curtain wall to the lower stories which could receive augmented insulation behind the solid panels. Please keep this in mind when preparing your calculations. So he's forwarding an email from Rockwool setting out their response to the 0.15 U value. I'm going to come back to that Rockwool response later. And in the second paragraph of this email, Mr. Soons is identifying that the build-up would probably only leave between 100 and 200mm for insulation, 200mm for the spandrels, and 100mm on the columns. And he's also saying that there are potential buildability and aesthetic issues. Can you just explain to us what you understood him to mean when you got this email about those buildability and aesthetic issues if you push the cladding line out any further?
I took this email to mean that the 200mm zone is all that it's ever going to be. We're not changing it now for good reasons. And I think how I took this was that Bruce was worried about not being able to achieve the 0.15, and this is why his last line about extra insulation at lower stories. I think he had a suspicion that we weren't going to be able to achieve the 0.15, but he's saying, well, but we could put more insulation on the lower levels if that helps balance out the overall calculation, so we could still achieve the target without actually changing the build-up that we're now working with, which is this 200mm of insulation at in the main areas of wall, and then a reduced amount around the columns.
Yeah. Did you understand Mr. Soons to be providing maximum thicknesses for the insulation in this email? Is that how you read it?
At this point, yes. That's how I read this, yeah.
Did you ever discuss with Mr. Soons or anyone else at Studio E whether the design could be altered to allow for thicker insulation, to allow a bigger gap between the concrete and the outer cladding?
Was the 2 points that I would make is one, that in the design team meetings there would be lots of discussion about these issues. So I would feel I would have understood a lot of the issues that Bruce was dealing with in terms of the daylight, the thickness of hangers. I realised that this number is part of a bigger picture, and so I didn't push that because I felt I understood that this was the compromise. This was the solution that we'd honed in on, was the best thickness for a whole range of reasons. Yeah. So I think that. And I've completely forgotten my second point.
So I asked you, did you ever discuss with Mr. Soons or anyone else whether to allow for thicker insulation, i.e. a bigger gap between the concrete and the outer cladding? Did you ever actually have that discussion with Mr. Soons?
No. And that was my second point, was from the very, very earliest emails that we had from Studio E, there was always Rockwool and Kingspan. Rockwool and, and so just embedded in my mind was this thing that Kingspan was okay. There was nothing wrong with using Kingspan. Bruce had suggested it in his first email. He'd used it in the online calculator in the email that we looked at previously. He said, I've given a stab at a U-value calculation, and there was a link.
Yes.
Email, if you follow that link.
Yes.
That was Bruce doing his own calculation using Kingspan. And so at this point, there was nothing to suggest to me that it needed to be relaxed in any way. We had something that was going to be acceptable. I thought it worked within the 200mm zone that we were all talking about. So it all just seemed to be slotting into place.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my rationale for saying we weren't having these conversations, because
Yeah.
thought it was working.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think that would be a good moment for a break. I'm about to turn to some more detailed questions
Yes.
about the specific
All right.
materials.
Seems like a good idea. Mr. McQuatt, we're going to have a short break now. We'll come back and resume at 25 to 12, please. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it. All right? If you'd like to go with the usher, she'll now look after you. Thank you. Right, 25 to 12, please. Thank you. Would you ask Mr. McQuatt to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. McQuatt.
Yep.
Happy to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I'm now going to ask you some more detailed questions about the consideration given to particular insulation materials on the project. And if we can go back to an email we looked at earlier, this is SEA 404973. And we can see there, we looked at it earlier, that as at that point, 5th of July 2012, Mr. Soon says he's sent off inquiries to Rockwool and Kingspan. You see that there. And we'll come back to each of those in a moment. There's no reference here to Celotex. Can you help us? Were the Celotex products being considered at this stage, or any Celotex products?
Not by name. In my mind, I think Kingspan. I mean, these are all brand names that we're looking at. By Rockwool, I mean mineral wool.
Yeah.
By Kingspan, we mean to me a solid insulation board, and so Kingspan, Celotex were kind of interchangeable.
Yeah.
In what I took that to mean.
I see.
Yeah.
And then we see that Mr. Soons gave an attachment to that email. And he says, see attached, which suggests approximately 450 millimetre plus of insulation. And if we can open up that attachment, this is a MAX 50101. Now, did you look at this attachment when you were sent it?
I can't honestly remember if I saw this attachment at the time.
Now, Mr. Soons told us in his evidence that this was an extrapolation from the Rockwool website. Were you aware of that at the time, that Mr. Soons had looked at the Rockwool project, extrapolated in terms of thicknesses, and that's where he got his 450 millimetre plus from?
I can't honestly remember.
Yeah, so you can't remember looking at this at the time?
No, I think I knew that Bruce had gone to the Rockwool website and made an assessment.
Yeah.
But I can't remember the details.
What he told us he'd done is basically extrapolate in the dotted line with the U value.
Yes.
So he's got certain thicknesses off the website, but then he's carried it on to get to the 0.15 U value on the left-hand side, and then extrapolated that might mean 450 millimetres approximately of Rockwool thickness. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Can you help us as to whether Max Fordham ever sought to clarify where that calculation had come from, or was asked to do a formal calculation for the Rockwool at this stage?
I don't think we were asked to do a formal calculation on the Rockwool.
Yeah.
No.
And then if we can go to SEA 404978, this is Max Fordham's response to Mr. Soons's email dated the 5th of July. It's from your colleague, Matt Smith, but you are copied into it. And as we can see from the first paragraph, in the second line, he says, those thicknesses of Rockwool seem a bit high. Does that also include the thermal bridging from the fastenings, frame, etc., and a ventilated cavity? For a glass fibre slab, excluding fastenings, etc., we'd expect to be able to achieve 0.15 U value with approximately 180 millimetres material only. Now, can you explain what steps you or others at Max Fordham took before saying those thicknesses of Rockwool seem a bit high? Are you aware of that? I appreciate this was your colleague, Mr. Smith.
I think we discussed the reply, so I think I have a good idea of what he would have done.
Yeah.
Like I described initially, doing U-value calculations for heating systems is a thing we would commonly do. So I think what Matt did was he did a quick calculation of his own, put in a Rockwool lambda value at that thickness, and he must have played around with the thickness of the insulation. He came to 180 which is what he came to, and that's a lot less than the 450. So I think
Yeah.
that's what's fed into his statement of this seems a bit high.
I see.
Is his own calculation.
He says the
Can I just ask? I mean, this suggests that glass fibre was one potential form of insulant, but nobody seems to have discussed the use of glass fibre. Was there a particular reason for that?
I don't know, and I suspect that we've just got slightly confused terminology in the email rather than meaning a particular.
Well, in what respect?
Perhaps Matt meant mineral wool. I think he probably just wasn't being very accurate on that term.
All right, thank you.
Because it's still a sort of a flexible insulation type, so it has a similar sort of look to it, and I imagine that's where the confusion
all right.
come from.
Thank you.
If he was in fact meaning glass fibre slab, is what you're saying that might give you some indication of what thickness a rock wool would be, because they're not dissimilar? Is that what you're saying?
They have similar lambda values. So I
see.
think his calculation was reasonable in that respect.
But just to be clear, did anybody actually do a calculation to work out what thickness of rock wool, of mineral wool, would be required to achieve the 0.15? Did anyone within Max Fordham do that at this time?
No, I believe that's what Matt was trying to do there.
Now, Mr. Smith queries in the email whether the thickness of rock wool, the 450 millimetre, includes the thermal bridging from fastenings, frame, etc., and a ventilated cavity. Can you help us as to how those factors might affect the calculation of the thickness of insulation and the U value that could have been achieved?
Yes. If you were to do a calculation and you were to factor in the metal brackets that must go from the concrete face of the structure, travel through the insulation to be able to fix the rain screen.
Yeah.
Those connections are a sort of a weaker link in terms of the more heat will travel through those connections, and so Matt is saying, I think we don't know what rock will have assumed. Perhaps they've been a bit heavy-handed in their assumption. I don't know. The difficulty I have with this email is clearly we haven't included for any thermal bridging in our calculation, which I think we should have done. So I think the 180 figure that's there is very only looking at a very idealised cross section through the material, and it's not looking at other things. So in reality, I would expect the answer to be somewhere between 450 and 180, depending on the other elements that were in play. But clearly, I mean, at this point, we didn't know the specific details of the cladding. And
I see. You talk there about what rock wool have assumed, but it's right, isn't it, that this was Mr. Soanes's extrapolation of some information on Rockwool's website to come to the 450 millimetres. So this wasn't Rockwool's calculation, was it, at this stage?
And that's correct. And I couldn't comment. Maybe we've misinterpreted that at the time, or I'm not sure.
And just to be absolutely clear, I think what you're saying is if you use thermally broken brackets that interrupt the thermal transfer through the brackets, that can help you in terms of achieving a lower U value. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be part of the calculation.
And Mr. Smith is querying whether Mr. Soanes, in his calculation, had taken account of that thermal bridging from fastenings, frame, etc. Do you agree?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry.
What Mr. Smith seems to be doing is questioning whether Mr. Soanes's calculation had taken account of the thermal bridging from the fastenings and frame.
I think what Matt's suggesting is that it's not that the Rockwool calculation hasn't taken it into account, but the Rockwool calculation might be a bit pessimistic in its assumptions, therefore coming up with a really thick insulation thing.
I see. That the Rockwool might be pessimistic in its calculations, or Soanes's calculations might look pessimistic if you haven't taken into account thermally broken brackets. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, let's look at the response we see from Rockwool. This is SEA 405276 on page 2, and it's an email from Mr. Ian Pritchard to Mr. Soons. And we know that you were sent this email on that same day. Again, I'll make good that point in a moment, but just sticking with this email from Mr. Pritchard, we can see that his response says, "Dear Sir," he says, "apologies for the delay in getting back to you. Further to your email, we would normally recommend the use of our rain screen duo slab for these types of construction. However, due to the low specified U value, the thickness needed would be exceptionally high, probably beyond the point of sensible building practice." And then he says he's unsure of the exact construction for the roof that needs insulating. So that's what Rockwool say. Now, can you help us? Did anyone ever respond and seek an actual calculation from Rockwool of what thickness would be required? We can see he's saying he thinks it's going to be exceptionally high. But did anyone ever get a specific calculation from Rockwool about what it would be?
Not to my knowledge. This was something that the Bruce was doing.
Can you help us as to why that wasn't something that Max Fordham ever did?
We had set the target, and it wasn't necessarily, if Bruce was designing this element and he was liaising with the specialists, then that seemed like the right way to be going about it, rather than us trying to get involved. It seemed like a reasonable thing that Bruce was liaising with the manufacturers directly to try and get some calculations done. So I think I would have read that email and taken the probably beyond the point of sensible building practice to mean all the things that I understood with Bruce in terms of length of brackets and all the other implications that might have on a building.
Did you expect, we know you forwarded this email in due course, did you expect that there would be a further follow-up with Rockwool to say, well, can we actually understand from you precisely what the thickness needed would be?
I don't think I ever expected that, no. Because in my mind, the Kingspan thicknesses were much closer to what we wanted. And so in my mind, receiving this email, I thought, okay, that's what it is. We won't be using rain screen geoslab then. We'll be using Kingspan and that, or something like it. That was what I read from this.
To your knowledge, was any effort ever made at any stage of the project to determine precisely what thickness of rock wool would actually be required to achieve the 0.515 U value?
I don't think it was, no.
Would you agree that rock wool was effectively discounted as an option on the basis of thickness?
Yes.
Can we just look at Mr. Hyatt's report? He's the inquiry's expert in architectural matters. This is at PHYR 603, page 19, and I want to look at the bottom of page at paragraph 3.5.8. Now, what Mr. Hyatt does is he does do the calculations using mineral wool to see what U value and thickness you could get. And effectively what he says, and he summarises it there in that paragraph, is that with mineral wool, it's possible for the spandrel slab condition to produce a 0.142 U value against a 250 millimetre mineral wool insulation. And for the columns to produce a 0.170 U value, so slightly above your U value target, against 180 millimetres of mineral wool insulation. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And Mr. Hyatt's calculations appear on the following pages. We can just briefly look at them at pages 20 and 21. We can see he's done the calculations for us. And this shows how he's come up with, here, this is on the column location, he's come up with the 0.17 U value. And if we go on to the next page, he's come up with the 0.142 U value with 250 millimetres of rock wool. Now, do you agree that Mr. Hyatt's calculations indicate that an insulating material using rock wool could have been accommodated without undue technical difficulty?
I don't think I can.
That's not for
I
you
don't
to
think I can
comment.
say that.
I see.
Well, can I just ask for a bit more help on that? Have you actually examined Mr. Hyatt's calculations?
I have looked at them. Yes.
You've been through them
I
to
have.
see whether there are errors or holes in them, shall we say? Have you found any errors or
Well,
holes?
Not errors. I see the calculation that Matt Smith sent in his email, where he came up with the 180 millimeter thickness, and you can see there that that's actually exactly the same calculation as Mr. Hyatt's done for the column, and he comes to the answer not of a U value of 1.5, but he comes to the higher of 0.17. I think he comes to, and I think that discrepancy between what we've done and what Mr. Hyatt's done is the thermal breaks, the bracketry. We
Exactly.
didn't include the bracketry in our simple calculation. Mr. Hyatt has, and I think that explains the
Right,
differences.
and to that extent, one could regard Mr. Hyatt's calculation as likely to be a bit more accurate. Is that
A bit more accurate, yes.
Right.
And I'd also caveat that by saying the assumption that he's made for the bracketry, I've not looked at that number in any
Yeah.
way to say that I would
And what
back
about
it as being accurate in terms of the construction.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. What about the spandrel calculation?
Again, that's the same. His calculation includes for thermal
Right.
bridging through the bracketry. Ours does not.
So again,
His is more
likely to be slightly more accurate. But, I mean, these are the sort of calculations with which you're presumably very familiar, are they?
Yes. Yeah.
And I ask you that because I think you said you haven't found anything to criticise in the calculations. No, that's just
Yes.
that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, that's really helpful. That was exactly my next question, is whether the difference between... No, it's fine. It's good. Whether the difference between Mr. Hyatt's calculations and anything you'd done at the time was because of the use of thermally broken brackets, which can make that difference. So
I think-
you've clarified that.
Sorry, because you keep saying thermally broken brackets, and I think my point is we didn't make any assumption for any
Yeah.
brackets,
Yeah.
thermally broken or not.
I understand.
And
Yeah.
then the other thing I would sort of say as well is clearly there is a discrepancy between the 450 that the Rockwell website might suggest and these calculations, and it's quite a big difference. And actually, when I probed that myself, I could see that the Rockwell website does make quite a large allowance for heat transfer through bracketry. But I'm in no way, I don't know the details of those two.
Yeah.
I just know that there is a large difference between the two.
But do you agree that these are relatively straightforward calculations that can be done, the ones Mr. Hyatt's done?
Yes.
And can you help us as to why such calculations weren't ever done on the Grenfell project for mineral wool, rock wool?
I can't, other than the 250 millimeters. Even with this calculation coming out 250 millimeters, it was still more than the 200 that we were working to as the maximum. So.
Well, then it would be an assessment, wouldn't it, for the architect about whether that increased thickness could be accommodated within the design satisfactorily. Yeah. Let's turn just now and just have a quick look at the Kingspan products. If we look at SEA 404986, we can see that on the 6th of July 2012, this is from you to Matt Smith, but you're copied in here, and we can see that what Bruce is saying is that Kingspan have come back with 200 millimetre phenolic to achieve 0.15 U value, see attached, and there's an attachment to it. And then he says, I've attached a data sheet for glass fibre product. I'm rusty on calculations, but I interpret this product as having twice the thermal conductivity of phenolic and therefore needing twice the thickness. Now, given Mr. Soon's comments in this email that 200 millimetres of insulation could be accommodated on the spandrels, Do you know why the Kingspan product wasn't pursued any further?
I think it's Kingspan is referring to a trade name
I see.
for solid, a phenolic foam, PIR, solid insulation. And so I think it was developed further in a... And I can come on to explain, I think I could explain now where I know exactly where Kingspan came from and why it appeared. And
Okay,
but we might come on
let's
to
take
this.
this one stage at a time. just first of all, are you saying that in your mind at the time there was little difference between a phenolic insulation material and any other foam insulation board,
That's right, yeah.
such as a PIR board? Did you actually know there was a difference at the time?
I don't think I did.
No.
I think I took Celotex and Kingspan to be two manufacturers that
Yeah.
that had insulation boards with similar lambda values,
Yeah.
and then that's as far as I
Now, we're coming on to the Celotex in just a moment, but help us then. You say you can tell us exactly where the Kingspan came from. What's your evidence on that? Pardon?
Where the Celotex came from. Sorry, you said where the Kingspan came from.
Yes, I thought you said earlier that you could tell us exactly where the Kingspan came from, but maybe you misspoke.
No, sorry, I meant to say I can tell you where the Celotex.
Great. If we can just hold fire on that for a moment and just let me keep going.
Okay.
At the time of your work on the Grenfell project, did you have any understanding of the fire performance characteristics of these foam boards, including phenolic or PIR insulation?
The only exposure we would have had, I think, to Kingspan is when they would come in to talk to us about pipe insulation, because they make solid pipe insulation as well as building insulation.
Okay.
And it's very difficult now to unpick what I've heard. And I know Bruce made a lot of comments about this material charring, and it's very difficult. I'm trying to. That could have been something that I had the opinion of. That could have been something that I thought, well, these pipe insulations will sort of char but not go on fire. But I couldn't say with 100% certainty.
Yeah,
that
Mr. McQuatt, we don't want you to speculate.
No, yeah.
I think what we're interested in is whether you do have a recollection of knowing something about the fire performance of these phenolic or PIR insulation boards at the time of the Grenfell project.
I couldn't say
No.
that I did.
And we see in this, and it picks up on the chairman's question a moment ago, that there's a data sheet for a glass fibre product. Now, when we look at that glass fibre product data sheet, it's got an A1 fire performance. Do you know whether any further consideration was ever given to the glass fibre product on this project?
I don't think it was. I think, and the reason for that is it would have twice the thickness. It would have twice the thickness. I think it was excluded at that point of this email. I think it was attached for information, but to me, the line about it being twice the thickness was just the point to stop.
So you wouldn't have looked at the data sheet and considered the fire performance of that product at the time? No. So FR5000, let's move to that, the Celotex product. If we can go to SEA 405840. So this is an email from you to Mr. Soons, dated the 16th of August 2012. And you say, Bruce, I've done the following calculations to work out how much insulation that we would need to achieve 0.15 overall. The Celotex FR5000 is a solid PIR board, data sheet attached. I think this is the only type of product that will give us the required performance. Kingspan also, I think it should say, do a version of this. And then could you comment on the spandrel panel? Now, as far as we can see, this is the first mention of Celotex's FR5000 product in this email. Is it right to say that it was you that introduced that Celotex FR5000 as a potential insulation product for the project?
Yes, it was.
What led you to put forward the FR5000 product at this stage?
So I was carrying out a calculation. So some of these emails have come, I think, slightly out of sequence with with how they happened. Bruce, I'd had a telephone conversation with Bruce, and we were discussing how he was unsure whether the fact that we couldn't put as much insulation on the columns, he was unsure whether that would mean that the overall U value wouldn't be enough. So I told him that, well, I could do an area weighted calculation. So I would calculate the U values of the column, the spandrel, and the window infill, and I would area weight them based on the areas of facade they make up, and that would give us an average. And that was something at that point that I think hadn't been done, and was kind of worrying Bruce that was going to mean we couldn't meet the target. So I said, well, I'll perform that calculation. So I went off to do that, and I think the spreadsheet was attached, I think, to this email, and I went off and did the calculation. And one of the numbers that I needed for the calculation was the lambda value of Kingspan board. And I went to the Kingspan website to download a data sheet so that I could get an accurate number for that lambda value. And you needed to log in and fill out and register as a user. In my head, there was very little difference between Celotex and Kingspan. I knew I had a login for Celotex, sorry. So I thought, I'll just speed this up a little bit, go to the Celotex website, I will get a data sheet for a solid insulation board, just to make sure that the lambda value that I was putting into my calculation would be accurate. It would be something that you could go and buy, essentially. Just basically showing you're working is how I felt about it. And that's how I ended up going to the Celotex website, clicking through. I think they have a sort of cascading thing, select insulation by application, and I think I would have gone through, walls, and I can't remember the exact detail, but I went through some sort of process, and it came out with, well, this would be an insulation. And I downloaded that. I took the lambda value and put them into that calculation. Okay. And then because I wanted to let Bruce know where I'd got that number, I sent him the data sheet. And I think there, my Kingspan also do a version of this. It kind of shows my kind of thinking that Kingspan and Celotex were very similar.
Did you or to your knowledge, Max Fordham, have any previous experience of using the FR 5000 product?
No.
Did you have a relationship with Celotex at this time? And you said you had the login details.
Again, it was a login details from previously trying to get a lambda value of an insulation type.
Now, Mr. Soons has given us some evidence about this, and I want to show you what he said. If we can go to the transcript, this is on the 11th of March, it's day 12, and I want to go to page 181 and just read what he says. And I want to pick it up at line 12. And I think it's me asking him, during your time on the Grenfell project, can you explain why you thought Celotex FR 5000 was suitable to be used within the overcladding system? And then he queries, why did I think that was? And then I say yes. And then his answer is, it had been put forward by Max Fordham, who I understood had undertaken this sort of project several times, or many times, and I guess I made an assumption that they had used this before in similar circumstances. So it was based rather on inferring its acceptability from previous experience by Max Fordham. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Now, did you appreciate at the time that in suggesting this product, Studio E were taking this as a tacit endorsement of its acceptability for use on the building?
I didn't realise that. No.
When you said in the email that you say that you think this is the only product that we're going to be able to use, what considerations did you have in mind? Did you have fire in mind when you made that
And the two things that I had in mind were the lambda value for the thickness, and in my mind it was almost interchangeable with the Kingspan, and the Kingspan had been on the table, put forward by Studio E in many emails, and so there was just nothing that sparked any concern that it wasn't okay.
Was any consideration given at this stage by you to its fire performance in any way at all?
No.
And can you help us as to why not? Why you wouldn't have been carrying out even very basic checks to see what its fire performance was before suggesting it on a project like this?
For one thing, it was... I wasn't aware that I was suggesting something new into the project. For one, I thought it was already there and established in terms of the use of the Kingspan.
Yeah.
The design of the facade isn't what we do, and I thought it was, I didn't go to any extra lengths to make that explicitly clear. I just thought it was clear in terms of my role as a building services engineer. So it's what I'd be looking at.
And is it your evidence that had you been able to log on to the Kingspan website when you first tried and been able to get some lambda calculations for their foam board, that you'd have been just as likely to put forward the Kingspan product at this point?
Exactly, yeah.
If we can look at the data sheet which you attached to the email, this is at SEA 405841. We can see on the top right-hand side that it's dated January 2012, and it's for Celotex FR5000. And if we look at the first list of bullets, halfway down that page, we can see that it states that FR5000 has Class 0 fire performance throughout the entire product in accordance with BS 476. That's the fourth bullet down. Can you see that on that page?
Yes.
Now, did you give any consideration to that part of this data sheet when you were putting forward that product?
I didn't know.
So you didn't consider what it was saying about Class 0 fire performance? That didn't enter your mind at all?
No. It was very, very much focused on the first bullet point, and they've actually put the lambda value in the text. That's what I wanted. That was the number I was after.
And were you aware, just in general terms at this time, that this product was a combustible insulation, and that there might be fire performance questions that needed to be asked of it in due course?
No, it just never. It sounds so silly to say this now, with all that's passed. But it just never occurred to me in any way that something that I could just go onto a website and select would be so unsafe or have the potential to be so unsafe. I thought I was, and I know we've covered that it didn't work on high rise, but it's also up until that point every building that I'd worked on, PIR installation boards on walls. I did a lot of projects. I'd seen it again and again and again. It was in my mind as just a common material that's used, and I had,
Okay. Now, we also see in that first bullet point that it says it has a lower thermal conductivity value, 0.021 watts per metre squared Kelvin, compared with other typical PIR insulation boards providing enhanced thermal performance. To what extent was that 0.021 figure key to you putting forward this product on the project?
It was the only number I was looking at, but I suppose as an example, I didn't find other insulation materials and sort of think, nope, not good enough, not good enough, not good enough, until I came to this one.
Yeah.
This was just the first one I came to, and I used this lambda value, if that helps answer.
Had this product had a lambda value which had been higher than that, let's say significantly high, would you have considered FR 5000 for use on the project?
I would say that at this point in the project, the solid board was always going to have a better lambda value than the rock wool, than the alternatives. So whether that was 0.021 or 0.024, as that number gets bigger, so does this thickness of insulation. And at some point, that thickness of insulation would have come out at larger than 200.
Yeah.
If that was the case, I would have done this calculation and I would have sent an email back to Bruce, and then there would have been a decision point to make. Do we relax the U value or do we change the build-up?
Yeah.
And it just so happened that I took that lambda value, I did the calculation, and it all fell within the parameters of this 200 millimeters. So it seemed like an ideal solution.
Okay. Now, can we now look at the Max Fordham Sustainability and Energy Statement that was prepared for the project? This is MAX 50412. This is dated the 17th of August 2012. And just to be clear, Mr. McQuatt, everyone on Max Fordham was clear, wasn't they, that they were dealing with a tall building, a building above 18 metres on this project?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And if we go to page 6 of this document, on the left column, on the first paragraph under 2.1, it's quite small writing, but what we see there under 2.1 is it says improving the insulation levels of the walls, roof and windows is the top priority of this refurbishment. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did that reflect your understanding of the position, that it was the top priority of the refurbishment?
Yes, it reflected my understanding, but also if we think about just the context, I was writing this report. You know, I may have been using slightly sort of artistic license to. This is firmly what I believed. It may not have been, when I say the top priority of this refurbishment, it may not have been everybody's top priority of this refurbishment, but it was certainly my top priority of this.
Yeah. There's no reference in here to fire safety also being a priority, is there?
No, but again, it's the energy statement to planners. I think that would just be taken as. I would have taken that as read. You know, it's so fundamental that I wouldn't have thought.
Didn't need to be stated.
Stated here.
Yeah. Now, on this page, we can see that the document explains that the recommended U value does exceed that permitted under the building regulations. This is the 4th paragraph down in the left column under 2.1. You can see in the second sentence, second line down, the proposed insulation levels far exceed those required by building regulations. You see that there?
Yes.
And is that the bit that you were explaining you drafted earlier? Because you go on here and say insulation improvements may only happen once or twice in a building's lifetime due to the complexity and disruption caused. For this reason, we are going over and above current building regulations to make sure the building continues to perform well into the future.
Yes, I wrote that.
You wrote that?
Yes.
And it's entirely consistent with what you told us earlier on this morning about your aspirations for this project.
Yes.
And we can see, just to finish this point, on the bottom of this column, there's a table, 2.1, which, if we can pan out and look at the bottom of this column, there we have a table 2.1, which tells you the extent to which what was being achieved on this project was an improvement over the building regulations, and we can see that it's a 50% improvement. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
And then on the same page, in tables 2.2 and 2.3, in the right-hand columns, if we can look at those, what we see is that Celotex FR 5000 is listed there as the insulation. It's in both tables for spandrels and columns. It's the third one down in the spandrels and the third one down in the column.
Yes.
Yeah. So at this point, Max Fordham, this is August 2012, are including the Celotex FR 5000 in the energy and sustainability statement, yes?
Yes.
And does it follow from that nobody had suggested to you prior to putting that statement together that that insulation wasn't appropriate for buildings above 18 metres?
That's correct, yeah.
And then if we go to the final Stage C report produced by Max Fordham dated September 2012, this is MAX 401683. Can you recall, did you draft this Stage C report for Max Fordham?
I would have drafted most of it, yes.
Yeah.
Matt would have done some sections, but I did most of it, I think.
And at page 12, is it right that what we effectively see here is the same information from that sustainability and energy statement replicated in this Stage C report?
I don't think it changed in between these two documents.
Now, how would you characterise what Max Fordham are doing here in terms of the insulation product? Are they specifying the use of FR 5000 in this statement? Or is Max Fordham doing something else? If so, what?
I think in this, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to show my working. I'm trying to show that this thermal conductivity value of 0.021 is based on an actual product.
Yeah.
When I look back at this, I think there's no need for me to write that in this document. It wasn't important information for this document whatsoever. In fact, both of those tables, you might say, are probably too much information for the actual target audience. What all they really needed to know was the information in table 4, which said we have a target and we're achieving it. And I think just because I'd done the calculation, I felt that, well, I'll put it in there just to show my working.
Yeah. By suggesting the use of that product, the FR 5000, were you seeking to influence the decision of the design team as to what material to choose?
I don't think I was. I think I was just trying to be very explicit about where I'd got that number.
I see.
Because if the project ran on and then someone did say, for any reason we can't use that material, it might be, remember at this point I have absolutely no idea how much Celotex FR 5000 actually costs. It may be 10 times the price of its competitor. I don't know. For some reason it might have been wrong, and I think I was just trying to show everyone what the assumptions were very clearly at that point.
The point you wrote this, was it your view that a final decision had been taken to use FR 5000 on the project?
I can't recall. I wouldn't have put that in there if there was any information telling me that it wasn't going to be used. But I don't recall having that discussion saying, yes, we've looked at this information we've looked at this and we're going to go for it. I think it was just in the planning. It never got corrected, and it went on like that.
I see. Now, in terms of this Stage C document, we can't find any reference to fire safety in here. Do you agree there's no references to fire safety?
I think the Stage C document might include an appendix on the heating options. There's no main section on fire safety, but there is a options appraisal of how we're going to replace the heating system. And I know in there we discuss fire stopping around pipework as a potential issue that might have to be managed if we're, So I would say that from the point of view of a building services engineer, we were thinking about fire safety issues that impacted on the work that we were specifying, pipework changes, but not in. This wasn't intended to be the definitive, and that's kind of why I said that this section goes into too much detail, because what it's really doing is it's really just wanting to convey that there are U-value targets, and these are the U-value targets that we're using in the energy calculations and simulations, and the detail isn't actually relevant to this report, really.
And just to be absolutely clear, is it right that FR 5000 was included in this Stage C report solely because it delivered the U value at the thickness you wanted?
Yes. I mean, you could pick up on you wanted and say that it was the team delivering a project rather than me solely being the owner of the thickness of that wall. And in fact, I wasn't.
I want to put this point to you directly so you have the chance to answer it. I want to put to you that Max Fordham and you as the project lead on this Max Fordham project, as experienced mechanical and electrical engineers, should have given at least some consideration to fire performance when proposing these types of insulation products for the external wall.
I think in hindsight, it's difficult to not have wanted to have reviewed all those things, and clearly over the past couple of years, it's a question. Should I have known more information than I knew in this different sector? And it's something that I go round and round, and I guess in hindsight, I would have just stuck to the numbers. I would have done that calculation without a data sheet. I would have just said, this is the minimum lambda value that is required. Carry on with your specification. But with so many things, you trip up when you try to be helpful, and you try to push the project on. You try to muck in, and in hindsight, I wouldn't have suggested Celtex FR or any insulation material because it wasn't my job. But
what about making expressly clear to the others on the project, including Studio E, that you hadn't considered fire safety? Did you ever do that at any stage on the project? Did you ever say to them, I've only looked at the thermal performance? To be absolutely clear with you, anything to do with fire safety of this project is down to you. Did you ever say that?
No, I didn't.
Can you help us as to why not? Why you wouldn't have made that clear?
Again, because I was just receiving emails that said Kingspan and Rockwool. Kingspan was always in the conversation, so the solid PIR board was just always in the conversation. So there was just nothing there to spark that level of, if I had been in any way aware that there was a danger here, then yes, I would have flagged that up and said, I've only considered thermal performance.
Yeah. I
just didn't think it was necessary at the time.
Now, we know that then in late 2012, FR 5000, Celotex FR 5000, was included as the insulation in the NBS specification that was prepared by the architect Studio E. Were you aware of that at the time, that particular product was in the NBS specification?
I can't say for sure, because now that I've seen it, it's very difficult to work out when I saw that line in the specification.
Did you ever have any conversations with a different Celotex product being used, say RS 5000, on the project? Did anyone ever discuss that with you at any stage?
No.
I just want to show you something Mr. Soon said in his witness statement. This is SEA 30144273 at page 118. And I want to look at paragraph 287. And in the first sentence, he says this: with regard to the insulation, I refer you back to paragraphs 43.9 and 116.2, where I discuss how the insulation was selected by Max Fordham. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And I want to focus on the use of the word selected. Do you agree that the insulation was selected by Max Fordham?
I know I did. I mean, clearly I sent an email. It was selected in terms of the lambda value, and to kind of expand that to me saying this is what should be used is to me quite a big jump.
Yeah.
And so I don't. If you start, if you take the word selected, it's, what exactly does it mean? It's quite, it's difficult. If you said did Max Fordham specify the insulation? It'd be, an unequivocal no.
Yeah.
But selected, suggested. I would say suggested to me is a more appropriate word.
Okay.
Of,
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I've come to the end of my questions, but it's customary at this point to just take a short break to see if there's any others that have been suggested and
Yes,
check
of course.
my notes, check I haven't missed anything.
Yes. Well, Mr. McQuatt, as you've heard, Ms. Grange thinks she's reached the end of the questions she needs to ask you, but she needs to have a little time just to check that. And there are others who are not in this room who may wish to suggest questions as well. So we're going to have a break. I'm going to say, 20 to 12? 20 to 1?
Yes, I think we'd have, yes. I was going to suggest 25 too, but that's a bit ambitious.
Well, if you think, I think it might
Yeah,
be a bit ambitious.
yeah.
We'll have a break until 20 to 1, and then we'll see if there are further questions that we need to ask you.
okay.
All right?
Thank you very much.
So, and please, of course, don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. And then if you'd like to go with the usher, she'll look after you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
20 to 1 then, please. Thank you. Could you ask Mr. McQuatt to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. McQuatt, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Ms. Grange.
Just a couple.
Yes, very well.
So you said to us just this morning that you went through, when you went to the Celotex website, and you said you went through a cascading process to get through to the calculations you wanted to find, the U-value calculations. Do you recall whether you were presented with an option for walls over 18 metres?
I don't think I was.
No.
I have no recollection of that.
And then sticking again with that episode when you were looking for U-value calculations for, you said initially the Kingspan product and then the Celotex product. Can we just go to something which we think you had earlier? This is MAX 40104. Sorry, 50104? Sorry. Yes. This is it. Yes, it's dated the 6th of July 2012. And do you remember we looked this morning at Mr. Soane saying he'd heard back from Kingspan and it was going to be 200 millimetres, and he attached a Kingspan document to that. That appears to be this. So it was sent to you. And if we look on page 2 of this, here we've got Kingspan's U-value calculations. For, we can see for a K15 product, Fordham K15. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
In the middle of the table. So my question to you is, if you had these calculations, this was the 6th of July 2012, why then on the 16th of August 2012, when you were looking at Kingspan and Celotex, why did you not just go back to these calculations that you already had from Kingspan?
I must have forgotten that
Yeah.
I'd received them. It would
Yeah.
make perfect sense to go back to this.
Yeah,
I don't disagree
okay.
with that at all. But
That's
I don't
helpful.
know why I didn't.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Those are all my
That's it.
questions. Thank you.
Well, Mr. McQuatt, it just remains for me to thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. Those are all the questions we have for you. It's been very helpful to hear what you have to tell us, and thank you very much for doing so. Can I just ask, have you got a long journey to make back to the north
Yeah,
now?
not going back till tomorrow, so I get to have a
I
bit
was
of
going to say, at least we've got through your evidence quickly enough to enable you to do whatever you need to do next. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and you're now free to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Ms. Grange, that's probably a convenient point to break, isn't it?
It is.
We've got another witness coming.
Yes, that's
waiting in
Mr.
the
John
wings.
White, the Clerk
Yes.
of Works, is coming at, this afternoon, and Miss Grogan is going to be examining him. Could I suggest that we perhaps take the lunch break now?
Well, that's what I was going to suggest.
Yes,
I think we'll
and
we'll
start
stop
at
now.
1:45.
Do you know whether Mr. White's here already, or what?
He is here, but he needs a bit of time to...
No, I just wanted to make sure
Yes.
he wasn't asked for 2 o'clock.
No, he's here.
He's here, right. Well, in that case, we'll break now. We'll take the hour for lunch now and resume at 1:45.
Thank you.
Is that right? Good. Thank you all very much. 1:45, please.